The left is trying to rerun the George Floyd playbook, and JD Vance is having none of it. Let's get into it. Before we do, my name is Casey, and I have been a husband, father, counselor, therapist, and a conservative man for more than a decade, and my 4 kids deserve to grow up in a country where they can have law and order. If you can get behind that at all, please like, share, and subscribe. Let's get into exactly what JD Vance said and the appointment of a new government official, a new bureaucrat, in order to try to stop the violence.
Wants to tell the truth. They ought to tell the truth that a group of left-wing radicals have been working tirelessly, sometimes using domestic terror techniques to try to make it impossible for the President of the United States to do what the American people elected him to do, which is enforce our immigration law.
In his most recent press conference, JD Vance says that this violence has been legitimized since 2020, and it's mostly on the left, and this was bound to happen when one of these obstructors that came in to try to obstruct ICE ended up having something bad happen to them. There needed to be this response in order to try to delegitimize President Trump's efforts within the country domestically. Watch this.
Taught them that ICE agents are engaging in wide-scale violation of people's rights. What our ICE officers are doing is deporting the millions of criminal aliens that were let in during the Biden administration. So number one, we have to say, as a matter of leadership, and I would appreciate if the Democrats would join me on this, let's be honest about the fact that we have way too many illegal aliens in this country. Our ICE officers should be supported in doing their job. You're trying to actually marshal the far left lunatic fringe to engage in doxing, to try to make it impossible for them to enforce the law, and in some cases actually to engage in acts of domestic terrorism against our law enforcement officers. When you talk about different plans, different protocols, different policies, I forget exactly how you asked the question. Here's the simple fact. What we're going to do is make it easier for the American people's administration to enforce the American
JD Vance
law.
starts by taking a shot at Tim Walz's administration, which is fully deserved. And of course, the Somali fraud from the Leering Center revealed by Nick Shirley and beyond is integrated into the attempts by ICE to remove some of the domestic fraudsters that have been stealing our tax money and exploiting the populace. And of course, Tim Walz is essentially to blame, because when you let corruption go unabashed through your state for decades and then possibly even benefit from that fraud, at least in the terms of votes that you get from those communities, then Tim Walz is complicit. And so the things that are happening in Minnesota right now are because of poor governance. This is what happens when you elect doofuses. Because he's a high school football coach doofus. That's what you get.
Now, can you comment on his rhetoric and Mayor Jacob Frey and whether they want to see unrest in Minneapolis?
Well, that's very tough rhetoric from a guy who just quit because his fraudulent activities have been uncovered. Look, Tim Walz is a joke. His entire administration has been a joke. The idea that he's some sort of freedom fighter, he's not. He's a guy who has enabled fraud and maybe, in fact, has participated in fraud. That's what this new Assistant Attorney General position is going to find out. I don't care what Tim Walz says. I care about getting to the bottom of this fraud for the American people, and I care about enforcing the nation's immigration laws. That's what we're going to stay focused on.
More has been revealed about the victim of the ICE shooting, and a lot of that has had to do with the fact that this young lady was essentially a professional who was going consistently and persistently into harm's way in order to try to obstruct legal orders that are being carried out by a administration which got the majority of the vote. And so if you don't like that, I suppose elect AOC or whoever next time, and you'll still have bureaucracy, but it'll be your kind of bureaucracy. And so she is being held up as some type of proponent of American values and kindness and empathy and sympathy, but really it seems like she has been revealed as being just a professional obstructor who gave up her children in order to be with somebody who, you know, is maybe less than reputable in her marriage, and then go into this at the encouragement of her significant other, which is, to me, something that young person will have to live with, the guilt and shame associated with that encouragement. However, JD Vance says it rightly that the media wants you to say, don't believe your lying eyes. There's more to the story, or you should wait for our narrative in order to make a determination on what you believe. And while I'm not certainly a criminal justice expert, I have seen the videos, and it seems pretty obvious to me, and JD Vance is just stating the same.
You have a woman who aimed her car at a law enforcement officer and pressed on the accelerator. Nobody debates that. I can believe that her death is a tragedy, while also recognizing that it's a tragedy of her own making and a tragedy of the far left who has marshaled an entire movement, a lunatic fringe, against our law enforcement officers.
Okay, this is exactly what we need. JD Vance and this administration needs to begin to arrest individuals who have been participating in funding these campaigns against ICE. The government needs to begin to frog march people who have been associated with funding these left-wing, basically Terry groups that are doing a lot of this dirt on the Americans. And I'm certain that there are people in Minneapolis right now and all throughout Minnesota who are coming from other states and need to be put in jail if they are just being paid to go protest. This is an insane. Who has enough money other than Soros or one of these alleged big funders of left-wing groups that are going out and just paying people to protest? Who would have enough money to do that? And whoever the Marxist turd is who is funding these groups wants our country to devolve into civil unrest and, yes, even civil war. This is absolutely the time, if there ever was one, to begin to take these groups asunder and to dash them up and make it so that my children can grow up in and amongst a population in a high trust society, and these paid protesters are certainly obstructing that.
Everything that you say is true. How does being part of that network justify being shot?
Well, being part of the network doesn't justify being shot, but ramming an ICE officer with your car, that's what justifies being shot. It's not a good thing, by the way, but when you force somebody to engage in self-defense, it's almost a preposterous question.
This White House reporter needs to have his press pass revoked because he obviously is putting words in the mouth of the person that he's asking the question, and the question is so beta. He's like, well, being part of this kind of network, how does that justify being pew-pewed at? And it's so absurd. It truly is obscene. You don't dislike these people enough. JD Vance is exactly right here that the only way that this will subside is if and when the leaders of the Democrat Party, or at least the groups that are behind the Democrat, like Act Blue, start to come out and say that this type of violence is not going to get us where we want to go, to electoral victories or to a high trust society where we can grow together as a people and unite as a people. And JD is exactly right here.
For example, if you are funding violence against our law enforcement officers, I'm not a prosecutor. My guess is that's not the sort of thing that earns capital punishment, but it should sure as hell earn you a few years in prison if you're funding the effort to try to assault our law enforcement officers. What is, I'm sorry guys, what's going on here? You guys are meant to report the truth. How have you let yourself become agents of propaganda of a radical fringe that's making it harder for us to enforce our laws? You just asked me a question that presumed that the reason why this woman died is because she was engaged in legitimate protest. She tried to run somebody over with her car, and the guy defended himself when that happened.
If you look online and you happen to check through TikTok or some of these other hellholes, it seems like most of the people who are chasing, harassing, doxing, and attempting to obstruct ICE agents are middle-aged white women. And I don't understand what it is that is in the water. Maybe it's SSRIs, maybe there's a bunch of other factors. But listen, guys, if I were a mother of three, I cannot imagine the evolutionary switch and antithetical. This is so antithetical to what would be adaptive in a young woman who has children, to go out and risk herself for someone who lives so far away that she has probably never visited nor could ever visit in her life. What on God's green earth makes someone who has so much to lose go put herself at risk in these types of situations? We must have a psychological revelation, a revival of godliness in order to give these people something to do. Because if your empathy runs so strong that you're willing to risk your life and the well-being of your children, apparently, in order to go defend someone, that strength of your empathy needs to be siphoned and honed into something that's actually productive instead of constantly believing that you need to rage against the machine. This was the perfect distraction at the perfect time for the Tim Walz administration, who is under some serious fire for letting this fraud continue in his state and then having an actual journalist go in and investigate it. Tim Walz needed this. And so now he can stand up in front of a microphone and say, well, I didn't even realize we were at war with the federal government. And then he can look like the left-wing hero that he always wanted to be. And while he's in the last 9 months of it as his administration, this is a legacy building time for him. And he's probably exuberant that he can bring this to bear on attempting to look like he's fighting against the federal government. Watch what he has to say about being the tough guy, trying to play this like he seriously wants civil unrest. He's even implicitly pitting the Minnesota National Guard against the ICE agents and others that are coming into his state, along with Mayor Jacob Frey, of course, who dropped an F-bomb about it because he's a super tough guy. Way to go, millennial beta. Watch what Tim Walz has to say about it.
Well, I said this yesterday. We've never been at war with our federal government.
Here is the real bomb that JD drops, and he says to the media, you should be ashamed of yourselves, which they absolutely should, because this is exactly the playbook. It's 2020 all over again, and I pray that the populace does not fall for it and give complete sympathy to these mobs of people who are coming in and trying to seem holier than thou. It is simply a piety test. They believe that they can win when there's a victim, and so the incentive structure is set up so that they will keep incentivizing victims by obstructing and doing other things to try to disrupt ICE, who was legally elected. This is what we voted for. We want our country to be our own. We want to stop fraud and corruption. And so this time, I pray that the American populace does not bite the apple, that they don't take the bait that the left is always trying to push, that there's a revolution at hand and that they are fighting against fascism. They have to be out of their mind. If you want to see fascism, go see Iran, where the leaders in that country are actively pew-pewing down protesters. That's what it looks like, folks. And not protesters that obstruct, just everyone, indiscriminately. That's what fascism looks like. Take a good look at what it looks like to exploit a people. We are just asking for fair and equal treatment under the laws of our government. Everyone, fair and equal treatment. That is not fascism, most obviously. Just because it comes from an orange man doesn't mean that you get to rewrite all the definitions of these things in order to make it your revolution all the time. The problem with the left is that the revolution never ends. And eventually it will come for all of them too, because even Bernie Sanders isn't pious enough at times. Even AOC isn't pious enough at times. And yes, even Mom Donnie will prove that he does not meet the piety test, because the revolution never has an end state other than the total state. That's what they're going for. But when any type of government action comes from an orange man or in a direction that they dislike, then it's fascism, except when it's complete left wing. But even when they get to that place, it's exactly what happens to every other communist regime. The whole thing crumbles because of the corruption at the top, and it will again if we allow it to happen here in America.
Everybody who's been repeating the lie that this is some innocent woman who was out for a drive in Minneapolis when a law enforcement officer shot at her, you should be ashamed of yourselves.
In this segment, JD Vance reads directly from a CNN headline, and I love this so much because the American people who might actually watch a press conference from the White House should know exactly what the media slant is that is being placed. And this is part of the problem here, is we just have diverging ideas of truth, and this is an insane claim on CNN's part, and good for JD Vance for pointing the finger at all of these turd touchers and telling them exactly where to stuff it.
Outrage after ICE officer kills U.S. citizen in Minneapolis. Well, that's one way to put it, and that is the way that many people in the corporate media have put this attack over the last 24 hours. And I say attack very,
we get
very
no
intentionally.
Coordination. They don't tell us they're coming. They don't say why they're sending the largest deployment in American history to Minneapolis. They're They're not making us any safer. We don't have any of that coordination. They should be talking to us when we do these things. Let us know.
And here is Tim Walz. I don't believe that this rises to the level of incitement, but it is certainly difficult to understand this any other way than saying that he stated, I said this today, we've never been at war. I should do the impression, right? I said this today, we've never been at war with the federal government. So Tim Walz is saying what? You tell me what we are supposed to conclude based on what he just said, and you tell me that he's not trying to present himself as the left fighting the right with civil, like with troops, like with the Minnesota National Guard versus the federal, the ICE agents and others that are coming in. This is Tim Walz presenting the opportunity for civil war. That's what he said. He said, we have never been at war with the federal government. He didn't say we are at war, but the implicit outcome that you're supposed to get to is that they are. That is an extremely dangerous statement. And I'm really glad that J.D. Vance sort of just deflected it and said, well, he wants to play like a tough guy. When Texas last year wanted to secure their border, they actually did go against the Fed, but they did it through legal channels. And so if Tim Walz wants to take this to court, that's what he was elected to do by, a bunch of people, including a bunch of probably non-residents in Minnesota. So go fight it through the proper channels. Don't pit your National Guard against the Fed. And what Trump ought to do is just simply deploy the Minnesota National Guard as part of the effort to try to stave off worsening riots and protests in that state, because he has the authority to do that. And then Tim Walz would have to eat crow, probably. But here's the conclusion I want us all to get to. I'm a psychologist by trade, right? A therapist by trade. This type of behavior puts everyone at risk. They come into my office and they sit down and they begin to share about problems that are going on in their day-to-day life without the understanding that all of this worry that they have about things that, aren't trivial, in many cases aren't trivial, but what happens if an actual civil strife starts in our country? That will ruin literally so many lives. It will tear asunder so much of what we have built for the last 250 years. And this political actor that is on his way out of office is risking all of us, literally, by making statements like this and then pressing buttons that he won't even have to wait until the launch, because he'll be out of office and he'll be able to, go play Elmer Fudd in his Minnesota home. But the rest of us will suffer, Mr. Walz, if what you're implying actually comes to fruition. So be very careful about your language, because while you can stand up there at the microphone, the rest of us are here living in the real world. And that is not something that we want to see happen in our country, Mr. Walz. So take it and shove it with walnuts. And I guess that's all I have to say. If you would like to see Tim Walz shove it with walnuts, please like, share, and subscribe. I'd love your support.